A friend of mine grew up in communist Poland. As a boy, aware that he could expect only lies from his country's radio waves, he used to spend many hours secretly listening to foreign shortwave radio broadcasts in order to learn the truth. He says that listening in this way, while living in the pressure cooker of a communist tyranny, had the effect of sharpening his powers of discernment, of increasing his sensitivity to all matters of good and evil. The truth, he learned early on, was something that you have to search for. Comforting lies, in contrast, are always like right there, readily available. Nevertheless, in spite of the moral clarity he had acquired as a child, he found that years later, after moving first to Great Britain and then to Canada, that he began to lose his moral ground. Intellectually inclined, he recalls that he began to lose his bearings in response to the charm and seductive power of the impressive writings of certain leftist-leaning British and Canadian publications. Entranced by what he called certain well-written articles, he failed for a time to discern the spirit of relativism that seeped through these writings. The spirit of relativism is that notion that there are no absolute truths. So he states that the effect of being absorbed in these writings had the effect of taking his powers of discernment away. They began to blur and slacken. He was, at the time, as he eventually came to see, being seduced by relativism. Now, he received the diagnosis of his condition from an ever-watchful father who warned that his son's soul was being smothered out of existence. My friend's father was, in effect, warning him against the spirit or attitude of relativism, which is that pernicious mindset or orientation that asserts that when it comes to making moral judgments, that there are no divine imperatives or absolutes. There are, in contrast, always and only relative choices, reflecting the notion that one thing is as good as another, or that, well, everything is beautiful in its own way. Which is, of course, a great lie. For the fact is that some things are anything but beautiful. Some things are, by nature, false, they are ugly, and need to be discerned and exposed as such. For example, it's a starry-eyed foolishness to regard a totalitarian government as in any sense beautiful. Totalitarianism is rather a horror, which a clear-eyed person understands. Such a one sees through what is dressed up to look good. Thus, a tyranny is always ugly, which my friend knew from first-hand experience in communist Poland. As was, by the way, similarly discerned by the Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who in the early days of Hitler's rise to power in Germany knew the man to be a looming tyrant. Undeceived, Bonhoeffer saw that Hitler was a depraved human being who was the embodiment of absolute evil. Such a man, Bonhoeffer clearly understood, would never respond either to reason or appeasement. Thus, while many were mesmerized by Hitler, were taken in by him, Bonhoeffer stood firm in opposition. Now, this spirit of relativism might also be called the spirit of the age. It's a subjectivistic spirit, and it's especially dominant and prevalent in today's landscape. It's highly like, for example, in almost any coffee shop where I go and study and write, that almost everybody around me would be some kind of relativist, which is to say that I think it's accurate for me to assume that everybody around me in these contexts would speak not of absolute objective values that require an adequate response from us, but rather that all judgments concerning values are matters only of personal taste or preference. For in the world of relativism, there is no right, wrong, good, or bad. There's only what one happens to prefer. It's whatever works for you, or some such drivel. The world of relativism is about different strokes for different folks, and to each his own, and there are no higher considerations than whatever it is that makes you feel good. Further, the relativistic spirit involves a kind of leveling out of all differences and distinctions. Nothing is better than anything else. Now, in every generation, this relativizing spirit presents itself as some kind of compelling way to live and to be. The relativistic spirit abhors any voice crying from the wilderness that calls for a return to objective standards and traditional values. The relativistic, subjectivistic spirit regards itself as, too sophisticated, it's too educated, too rational to honor and bow to the ancient wisdom of time-tested standards and values. It regards the wisdom of the present age, this new age, to be a progression over all that has gone before. It is thus a spirit of defiance. It's a spirit of rebellion that lacks humility before reality, that lacks humility before absolute and binding truth. It thinks it knows better. It regards itself as enlightened beyond any age before it. It's thus an arrogance that tends to disparage the inherited wisdom of scriptures, of traditions, of sages and seers. Its clarion call, we might say its prime directive, this spirit of the age, is to practice its supreme virtue, which is tolerance. But since no one can ever say, in the spirit of relativism, that any one thing is better than another, the relativist lives in a foggy moral haze. The relativist says, for example, that it's okay to do almost anything as long as it doesn't hurt anyone, failing to take into account that in every action we take, whether small or big, we're either serving to elevate or serving to take down. Thus, there simply is no such thing as some kind of neutral stance of tolerance. This supposed neutrality is but a slick avoidance of the necessity to choose well which side you're on. As Bob Dylan once sang, you may be the heavyweight champion of the world. You might be a rock and roll addict prancing on the stage. You may be a state trooper. You may be the head of some big TV network. You may be rich or poor. You may be blind or lame. You may be a construction worker. You may be a preacher with your spiritual pride. You may be working in a barbershop. You might like to eat caviar. You might like to eat bread. You may be sleeping on the floor, sleeping in a king-size bed, but you're going to have to serve somebody. Yes, indeed. You're going to have to serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil and it may be the Lord, but you're going to serve somebody. How I remember those words from the 70s. In other words, you're serving truth. You're either serving truth or you're serving lies. It's one way or the other, and you're going to have to choose. That's what it's about. What side are you on? Accordingly, therefore, we are not, for example, serving truth by looking away from and tolerating that which cries out for judgment and rebuke. But of course, the one living in the misty state of relativism thinks, I must not judge. When in fact, that is precisely what we are called to do. We're called to judge well. It's a divine imperative to judge wisely. We're to make judgments about what is or is not a good life and a moral life. We're called to make clear and strong judgments concerning right, wrong, good, and bad. By refusing to judge, the relativist, consequently, does not know who he is. Addlepated, he has lost his way. He's living out what the New Testament calls the broad way, which it warns always in the long run leads to destruction. But the relativist, of course, doesn't want to be regarded as narrow. He prides himself on being what he calls open-minded, he's broad-minded, he's non-judgmental. In a word, he's an idiot. Now, in contrast to the practice of idiocy is the choice to live by what the New Testament calls the narrow way, like the particular way. And that, it says, leads to life, which is a call to live intelligently. Like it's an awakening to intelligence. It's a call to hate evil and to love the good. The call is to choose well, in other words. Now, my friend's father challenged him to listen to other voices than the writings he was engaged in, to bring him back to himself. And in particular, he recommended a particular brilliant conservative voice on American radio. Well, my friend took his father's advice and thus began to listen to a voice of truth that brought him back to himself. And now today, many years later, the result of that early focus was that my friend is now known as someone of high moral principles and of great integrity. He hadn't fully realized during his early days in Great Britain and Canada that it was not only in communist Poland that a seeker of truth would have to make an extra effort to listen to distant truth-bearing voices. Well, it was C.S. Lewis back in the 1940s who warned of what he called a poison of subjectivism that was taking over in British society. In The Abolition of Man, Lewis made the point that the relativistic spirit was creeping into children's classrooms through their textbooks. The substance of his warnings was that the objective values were being reduced to subjective feelings. The stance of subjectivism, according to Lewis, is that, and I quote, all sentences containing a predicate of values are statements about the emotional state of the speaker. Like, it's not about truth, but it's about what you happen to feel. And secondly, that all such statements, therefore, are unimportant. There's the relativism in a nutshell. The general philosophy being espoused here is that all values are subjective and trivial, which is why if you happen to be somewhere, I say, for example, a Vancouver dinner party, and you dare even casually to suggest that abortion is a moral evil, that you can almost guarantee that you'll suddenly hear an angry voice, or several of them, scream back at you, well, that's just your opinion, followed by the statement more often than not that, well, you're intolerant and you're judgmental. You will, in other words, most assuredly be shouted down by the people who tend to go running around saying that everything's beautiful in its own way. Everything's beautiful, say these relativists, except that they never accept as beautiful the moral absolutes of the world's great religions. Rather, the ideals and standards of the world's great religions are on their hit list. How often have I seen these lovers of tolerance and of diversity, the everything is beautiful crowd, turn suddenly into a swarming, shouting mob. They're against, they say, moral absolutes, but strikingly absolutist when it comes to making their own judgments. Professor Gene Elstein tells of when he interviewed a candidate for a political science job at his school. For this fellow, everything was a preference. He was in this relativistic fog. So Dr. Elstein issued him a challenge. It's a curious thing, is it not, that when Martin Luther King delivered his great speech, that he cried, I have a dream. He didn't say, well, I have a preference. How do you explain this? Is there a difference? Well, the man was flustered. He couldn't bring himself to acknowledge there was a huge difference between a dream that was like a divine imperative or call or summons. He couldn't tell the difference between the dream and a preference. The interviewee could not tell the difference because he was a man without a chest. That is, his powers of discernment had atrophied. He had fallen into the swamp of relativism. He was stuck in subjectivism. C.S. Lewis warned that in the reduction of values to feelings, that something precious and irreparable is being lost. Indeed.